Hello, and welcome to the Free American Voice, Episode 1 on Texas's Senate Bill 8, otherwise known as the Texas Abortion Law. My name is Raj Ashar, and I'm a senior editor at Midwestern Citizen and a senior at the University of Michigan.
Hello, my name is George Sdregas. I'm a staff writer at the Midwestern Citizen, and I am a junior at The Ohio State University. Would all the panelists like to introduce themselves real quick? We could start with David.
Hi, I'm David Jordan. I'm an associate editor at Midwestern Citizen and a second-year student at The Ohio State University.
Hi, I'm Rachel Bixby. I'm a staff writer at Midwestern Citizen and a recent graduate of the University of Michigan.
Hi, I'm Isabel Schindler. I'm a staff writer at Midwestern Citizen, and I'm a junior at the University of Minnesota.
To begin, Rachel, would you like to start with an overview of the Texas abortion law that we'll be discussing today?
Sure. So the Texas abortion law, or SB 8, essentially banned abortions through a vigilante enforcement mechanism, where instead of having the state enforce a ban against abortions after a quote unquote fetal heartbeat can be detected, instead, citizens are encouraged to sue each other or anyone that aids and abets the process of getting an abortion after a 6-week or fetal heartbeat detection is possible.
And so there's been a lot going on with this law recently. David, do you want to just give us an update on kind of the legal landscape of it?
Absolutely. SB 8 has presented a bit of a legal game of ping pong, is how I've been describing it, simply because there's been a lot of changes in terms of whether the law is enforced, whether it won't be enforced. Initially, the law was allowed to go into effect by the Supreme Court. They denied the request for preliminary injunction early in the process, right before the law was set to go into effect. Then, a few days after the law went into effect, U.S. District Judge Robert Pittman allowed a preliminary injunction, meaning the law was prevented from going into effect. But only a little while after that, and most recently, the U.S. Court of Appeals, a 3-judge panel on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, granted what's known as an administrative stay. So the law now is back into effect. It was allowed to go into effect, then it was prohibited, then it was allowed once more. And the court will now decide whether to grant the state's request to allow the law for a longer term hold. And they have until Tuesday at 5 p.m. So as we're recording this, that'd be until October 12th at 5 p.m. Central to make that decision. So it's a little bit in limbo right now. Technically, the law is in effect, but it's gone back and forth over the past couple of weeks. And now there will be a more permanent decision made by the Court of Appeals in the coming days.
Awesome. So yeah, it's definitely a very controversial and hot topic right now, which is why we have 3 members of our staff that wrote on this topic. So Isabel, do you want to start by just kind of giving a summary of your article and talking about why you chose to approach the Texas abortion law from that angle?
Yeah, definitely. So my article first examines the logic of Senate Bill 8, or the logical argument behind it. And then I just look at pro-life and pro-choice philosophical arguments and kind of try to explain, I guess, the morality of abortion. And I chose to look at it from this angle just because, the Texas law is clearly unconstitutional, but is the pro-life argument, morally right? So I guess instead of taking a legal perspective, I wanted to, dig deep and see if I could find philosophical flaws in the Texas law.
Awesome. And David, do you want to just talk about the kind of legal perspective that you take in your article?
Absolutely. My article focuses mainly on the legal mechanism used by the lawmakers to pass SB 8 and to kind of circumvent the normal review process for this kind of law. The reason I chose to focus on that angle and the mechanism that I believe Rachel referred to as the sort of vigilante approach to enforcement is that the real issue in this case, I think, is that enforcement mechanism. Abortion law itself, that is the standard set by Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, is already on the docket to be reconsidered this fall term. I believe it's December 1st. The court is hearing arguments in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, and that will be really crucial for the future of abortion rights in general. The main question at issue in this case is whether or not this specific vigilante mechanism is legitimate. And I argue that it's not. I argue that by deputizing citizens to enforce a law, and just to back up for a second and explain that a little bit more, the way SB 8 works is that instead of being enforced by a state actor, the laws are enforced by the people, meaning that the people could file a civil lawsuit against an abortion provider or anyone who is shown to be aiding or abetting in the process of obtaining an abortion. And essentially, citizens are allowed to sue those people who may be involved in the process and receive up to $10,000 of restitution, even if they're not directly involved or directly harmed by what's occurred. So the reason this is done, as Justice Sotomayor pointed out in her dissent, was to circumvent the normal review process, so that instead of putting together an injunction against the state or against actors of the state, the enforcement mechanism is widely distributed across all the people. So it's not clear how or if an injunction can be issued. So the Supreme Court allowed the law to go into effect while this works its way through the legal process. I argue that this could be really problematic because it could create a pathway for other unconstitutional laws to go into effect, where even though there is a constitutionally protected right to an abortion, this novel procedural mechanism has allowed this law to go into effect, even though it does violate this constitutional right. And I argue that the same thing could happen with free speech, with gun rights, with other unconstitutional laws that could be passed by states. It creates a real slippery slope that is frankly at risk of undermining some key constitutional principles.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of impacts that are going to be felt from this law. And Rachel, do you want to talk about kind of the angle you took with your article?
Sure. So mine wasn't about the enforcement or about anything to do with the morality of being pro-life or pro-choice itself, but more what are the arguments being used to further this law, and in what way are those valid and invalid? Basically, they're using a lot of scientific terminology and trying to present the argument for this bill as something that is logical via science, which, for looking further into that, is just inaccurate. Calling it the heartbeat bill, for example, and scientists have explained that it's not a fetal heartbeat, and that it's actually, this is a completely made up point of deciding when women should not be able to have an abortion. And then looking at, well, why is that? Why is it that so early on abortions need to be essentially banned? And the reality behind that being this issue of separation of church and state, and how so many of the people who are pro-life and specifically want their pro-life agenda to be enforced through the state and effective on everybody, not just their own personal decision. How are they making that possible? And since you can't go out and say, this is my belief system that I want enforced on everyone else, they're trying to use science to say that there is a different way that this argument is being backed, but it's full of falsehoods and inaccuracies. So that's what I go into, and essentially explain how that this is going to be dangerous moving forward, and how other states are already following suit in this, and how that's really detrimental to our principles of separation of church and state and overall religious freedom in this country.
Yeah, Rachel, I want to take a step back and start at the fundamental inaccuracy you talk about in your article. I think it's a really good starting point, because it's like the base assumption made by the policymakers making this bill, specifically that distinction between the heartbeat and what you call the pulsing embryo. So if that inaccuracy didn't exist, like, how do you think that would change the policy making around this law?
Well, I think it would be a lot harder to have ban this early on in a pregnancy. 6 weeks is extremely early on. Most women do not know that they are pregnant 6 weeks into a pregnancy. And I think that a lot of the people furthering this agenda have held on to the idea that a heartbeat means a life. So if you're able to call something a heartbeat that's not a heartbeat, you're able to move it out as early on in the process as we want. And if they couldn't do that, if they had to call it a heartbeat once there was actually a full fetal heart developed, that ban would be much later on, more like 20 weeks, and would be a lot less effective at reducing the amount of safe and legal abortions.
So, kind of David, from your article, like, what would you say to the pro-life listeners of this podcast who may feel that the law is justified simply because it prevents abortions?
That's a great question. And it's something that I wanted to touch on because I know that in each of our articles, we're obviously opposed to this law for a variety of reasons. So I wanted to speak a little bit to the people who might be listening and say, well, hey, I believe that abortion is not morally justified, and that even the taking of an innocent life, albeit an unborn one, is morally wrong in all circumstances. So of course we should go to any means to protect that life. To which I would say, I think that this law creates a little bit of a slippery slope. And specifically what I wanted to highlight in my article is the ways in which this legal mechanism used by the Texas lawmakers could be used to justify other unconstitutional laws. In a episode of his podcast, Advisory Opinions, the conservative legal commentator David French recently spoke on this, and he brought up the example of gun rights, that potentially a deep blue state could pass a law that says, you're not allowed to own any guns, but we're not going to enforce this law. We're actually going to allow your neighbors to sue you if they see that you own a gun. Now, under this precedent that's set by this Texas law, the Supreme Court would not offer an injunction under that case, in which case the law would be allowed to go into effect, despite the fact that it's a blatant violation of the Second Amendment. And even if the law were reversed later on, it would still create a very chilling effect on gun ownership in this country. It would likely create a lot of legal fees that would be exorbitant for gun owners. It would create a serious problems for people who are seeking to exercise their constitutional rights. And so, as French said, this is a be careful what you wish for kind of court decision. And I would certainly say that it's worth bearing in mind the potential precedent implications of this kind of law.
Just to follow up on that, like, have we seen recently, like, have there been other states that have been following suit of Texas, like, in terms of abortion, or even with any other issues where citizens are enforcing or asked to enforce the law?
We have seen this already. Florida Republicans, at least one Florida Republican lawmaker, recently introduced a bill that follows the exact same pattern of the Texas law, seeking to ban most abortions and enforcing this by private citizens filing lawsuits against those who are aiding or abetting the performance of an abortion. And just like in Texas, those who sue are eligible for up to $10,000 in restitution. So we've already seen this kind of copycat law in Florida. It's very likely, I think, that we'll see it in other states. And I think it's possible that we could see it on other issues. We could see it with other types of constitutional violations, because ultimately the point is to circumvent this normal review process and allow laws to go into effect, despite the fact that they would be overturned by legal precedent.
If I may add an additional answer to the question you posed, Raj, I think that most of these lawmakers are very aware that, one, any abortion ban does not reduce the amount of abortions being sought after. It only reduces safe abortions, and that anybody with means will always have access to safe abortions. They'll always be able to travel or pay doctors under the table. What really comes from an abortion ban is not less abortions, but more people dying from receiving abortions.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept, like how lawmakers have to process what's going to happen when they pass this bill. And I think something that Isabel touches on a lot is the moral and philosophical implications of what might be going through their minds. So I'd like to ask Isabel, you've talked about a lot of philosophical arguments. They've been investigated for years. This has obviously been debated for a long time. Like, what do you think are the strongest like moral arguments for and against abortion that these lawmakers deal with?
Yeah, definitely. So when I was first researching for my article, I'll say first, I consider myself very pro-choice. And when you look at the arguments out there, it's pretty interesting that pro-life arguments are philosophical arguments, anyways, are very simple, very straight to the point, and they're very hard to challenge. I think the typical pro-life argument and also the strongest argument is all fetuses are humans. Every human has the right to life. Therefore, every fetus has the right to life. Therefore, abortion is wrong. And you can't really, fight back against that. You can't really find flaw in that. But I think there's also the argument that you can say fetuses aren't human. And I think proving that, I think the strongest argument, and I present an argument which is inspired by other philosophers. It's not my original argument that I write about in my article, but I define personhood instead of genetic humanity. And it's pretty clear using certain traits of personhood that a fetus is not a person. Therefore, a fetus does not, have full moral rights, including the right to life. And it gets pretty confusing. It's a very complex argument when you're arguing that abortion is permissible. But I think it can be done. It's just a lot less simple than just saying fetuses are humans, therefore they have the right to life. If that makes sense and answers your question.
Yeah, and so I think just going into that, I'm interested in like, so what were like the conditions for personhood versus just kind of being human?
Yeah, so philosopher Mary Ann Warren, she has 5 traits of personhood that she uses, and it's I'm just going to read straight from my article. It's consciousness, reasoning, self-motivated activity, the capacity to communicate by any means, self-awareness, and I added a 6th one, which is detachment from a mother's body, because using those 5 traits, that would leave out, I guess, someone in a vegetative state. So by adding that 6th one, it makes it specific to fetuses.
Now, I'd like to swing this over to David because you make a pretty clear distinction between like the moral arguments behind the law and like the rational, practical arguments behind the law and its legal implications. So do you want to like talk about the interplay between the two? Talk about like if they could truly be separated, should moral considerations be taken like into consideration when talking about this law and like how they play on each other?
Yeah, I'm glad we're getting to discuss this issue because I know that obviously Isabel and Rachel both went into the moral implications of this kind of law in a very different way than I did. I sort of sidestepped that and said we're going to focus on the legal mechanism specifically. I've hammered that, legal mechanism. But I want to talk about this a little bit because I think it's important to keep in mind, even as we do address the practical concerns of a law like this, that the moral concerns are just as significant and just as important. In my article, I wanted to focus on the practical elements of the specific, legal mechanism, because I believe that it matters that we look at how these laws will actually play out and what precedent we're actually setting with this or that court decision. But at the same time, it's worth acknowledging that all law is based on certain moral assumptions. It's based on assumptions about what it means to be human. It's based on assumptions about what bodily autonomy means, about, as Isabel was just saying, about what personhood is. And it's important that we address these questions as well, and recognize that they're not peripheral, they're not inherently separate, because all lawmakers are going to have to consider them as serious parts of their decisions about whether or not to pass some of these things. And so what I wanted to highlight here is that I think that really calls us to try to find common ground on some of these issues. It calls us to look at them as equally important, where it's easy to say in a pluralist society that I'll just have my view on this issue and you have your view on this issue. And to a certain extent, that allows us to get along. But at the same time, it's very important, I think, that we recognize how foundational these moral questions are, that we don't push them to the side, and that we're willing to ask and we're willing to engage with each other on some of these topics, like what does it mean to be human? That's just as important as what does this or that specific legal mechanism do.
Yeah, I think your point there on kind of settling this kind of disagreements, like a very important one. And I think, Rachel, from your article, you talk more about kind of the political aspects of it. So what would you say to lawmakers who are trying to use these kind of loopholes that we see in the Texas abortion law to pass laws like these?
Well, about the loopholes specifically, I would say that it's extremely important when using science to use it precisely, because that is the entire point. And if you're not doing that, then you are furthering an agenda by picking out the pieces that sound good to you, which of course only creates more and more issues with law, and law has to be more precise than that. So I would say that they should come forward with what their actual reasons behind this is. And if they do believe it's a life, why, and that's the reason why it needs further protecting, why is their belief about what's a life more important than anyone else's belief? And why is it more important than somebody's decisions that they make with their doctors and with their families? And it's very complicated. And I would also, of course, bring up that they know that they, having means, would always have the ability to have someone they love get an abortion, and God forbid they've been assaulted in some way or have some serious medical issue where it would be dangerous to them to carry out a pregnancy. I would say, you know, that you'll be able to get out of that situation. How do you justify putting others in that same situation that they won't be able to get out of?
I think it's interesting also that when we see in the political discourse, we don't kind of see that these like moral arguments that kind of Isabel brings up in her articles. I mean, we do see like politicians say maybe abortion is morally wrong, but there's none of that like looking at personhood or like the specific reasons for that morality being wrong. So I was wondering if anyone had any opinion on like why that's maybe absent from our political discourse.
Well, I think it really is a value judgment, and you can use scientific points to point at and say, well, I think this many weeks because this is when this body part's developed. But at the end of the day, it's whatever you define as a person. It's your interpretation of the scientific facts. You can say that once it has its own DNA, then that's its own person, but that's a value judgment, maybe even a religious judgment. Maybe it's just your personal judgment. But in what way is that more valid than anybody else's interpretation? And I think that everybody knows that we can sit here and argue endlessly. Well, I think it's this, I think it's that. And since there isn't a conclusive personhood via science or any other means, that you shouldn't be able to control other people's freedoms based on your interpretation and your value judgments.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting. Like a lot of the ideas and words we've heard like throughout this conversation has been like value judgments, interpretations, disagreements. And I'd like to open this to everyone, but I want to like specifically hear from Isabel first. Like, do you think there'll ever be a consensus on this? Like in reading your article, it feels like you offer a pretty objective idea of like this personhood and that there might be like a true answer that everyone can agree upon through your article. But do you think like society will ever come to a consensus on like what's the right thing to do in regards to a law like this?
In a perfect world, I would like to think yes, but realistically, no. I don't think there will ever be a consensus because, like I said before, although I find the argument that I present in my article to be correct, I can't find fault in the pro-life argument, really. When it comes to making an airtight moral claim regarding abortion, it's pretty all or nothing. Either a fetus is a human being or they're not. If a fetus is a human being, you argue that it's a human being from conception. Therefore, abortion is wrong at any stage in pregnancy. And if you make the argument that I made, where I say a fetus is not a person, it doesn't have any of the traits of personhood, I'm essentially saying that abortion is permissible through any stage of pregnancy. So it's very, and then like what Rachel was saying, there are some philosophers that have made arguments that the mother's right to choose trumps the fetus's right to life. But even then, it becomes very tricky, and there's a lot of room for questioning. So really, it's pretty all or nothing. And I think people, if they're going to pick a side, it's going to be on one end or the other. And there doesn't seem to be one right answer. There just seems to be disagreement on whether or not a fetus is a human being or not. And it's kind of whatever, what value judgment you want to make. Unfortunately, there's not a right answer. And that's kind of how my article ends is, I think I say, maybe the one right answer is there's no right answer, something like open-ended like that.
So David, from the legal standpoint, do you think a consensus is possible there, even if like maybe a moral value will never be reached by everyone? Like, is there like maybe a legal standpoint or like a law that could reach a consensus of people?
I think that's a very difficult question. Obviously, it's I can only speculate on what the answer is, but I would argue that I think you'll always have people on both sides of this issue. I don't know that you'll ever reach a full consensus because, as I mentioned earlier, our legal conclusions always precede or proceed from our moral convictions. And so difference of moral conviction will always lead to a difference in legal opinion. I don't think that's a reason to stop having these discussions or stop trying to seek common ground. But at the same time, I think that there are in some ways, I think that in some ways there may never be a complete consensus.
So I thought it was interesting that like all these moral arguments that have been mentioned for and against abortion, like with them, I haven't heard any about like a kind of consequentialist argument where it's basically saying, hey, maybe I do think it's wrong because a fetus is a person, but because maybe the effects of making abortion illegal are so bad, the loss of lives is worse in that case. For that reason, we should have legal abortions. I was wondering if anyone had kind of come across any articles really voicing that opinion in their research.
I think that's an interesting idea, but I think that it's another one that doesn't really go anywhere because it relies on one's preconceptions about personhood. As Isabel was saying, it does get a little bit black and white, where either a fetus is a human being or a fetus is not a human being. And if a fetus is a human being, well, then every abortion entails the loss of a life. And if it's not, then presumably there are no meaningful moral restrictions on abortion. And so I think that it's a little bit of a Rorschach test in that you could just kind of see whatever you are already predisposed to seeing.
Well, I think the consequential arguments are really interesting. And that was sort of going to be my answer to your previous question about will we ever reach a consensus, where I think no, and definitely no in terms of people's opinions on abortion and whether or not people should have them. But I'm hoping that there's more of a consensus on whether or not there should be a legal right to, and that we would go more towards yes, and possibly with some restrictions, because while it can be black and white for some people of this is a life, this isn't a life, I think that there are more grounds about, well, if it can be removed from the body and be viable and live, then that's a little bit different than one that it wouldn't survive outside of the mother very early on in a pregnancy, something like that. So while I think that there'll always be some restrictions, I'm hoping that those who say, well, I think abortion's wrong and I would never get one, recognize the importance of there being some legal right to, and that there would be some type of overall consensus legally in that way, or at least for the most part, because it is a democracy. Not every single person has to agree with what our general rights should be. But I think if a vast majority of people were saying that it should be your personal choice, no matter what I think about it, that would be really beneficial to the laws going forward.
So I guess I just want to switch to kind of a final topic for our discussion today, which an interesting part of this whole like Texas abortion law is having citizens being the ones enforcing it, not the state. Really, as the citizens are the one reporting people who help in getting an abortion. So I was just wondering on if anyone can answer thoughts on kind of maybe the effects of this on kind of the societal cohesion in jurisdictions where this is enacted.
Well, it cannot be good for society, for citizenship, for personhood, for brotherhood of the people, anything like that. Those attitudes where you're making people hate each other, turning everyone against each other. There's already been cases explaining that people are already doing it for money, and not even about whether or not they think it's wrong. And then that creates a huge socioeconomic factor to it, where you're supposed to be, I guess, ideally suing people who are aiding and abetting abortions, getting abortions because of the wronghood, the lifehood, and it's already about the $10,000 reward. And it just creates a really dangerous society that, again, only people without means will be living in.
I think it's possible to overstate the effects that it might have, but I agree with Rachel that it can't be good. That it's unlikely that a law like this would be beneficial for any kind of social cohesion. And again, I go back to the examples of what this law might look like in other contexts, where a law that severely restricts gun ownership like this, would it inherently increase distrust between neighbors, distrust between friends, even distrust perhaps between family members? And so I do think that there is a real risk of that with a law like this.
Awesome. So I think we had a great discussion today on kind of the whole legal, political, and moral landscape surrounding this Texas abortion law. I think it's a very important issue. We're going to see more obviously play out. I mean, there's news coming out about it seemingly every week. I want to thank all of the panelists and my co-host George for talking with me today about this. And thank you to the listeners. Definitely check out Isabel, David, and Rachel's article on MidwesternCitizen.com on the Texas abortion law, and just check out our other articles as well. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Thank you.